So welcome, and I hope that the conference has been wonderful for each of you so far. Um, this is just as like a little disclaimer slash to let myself off the hook a little bit. I was telling some folks here that I am both a hand talker and a traveler a bit for my presentation. So I just could be white knuckling it the whole time. So I'm going to try to be, myself while also standing behind a podium with a mic and a camera pointed at me. And then also I can't see some of my friends behind this pillar. So I'm going to just do my best. So I hope you all can be in it with me. So welcome to Media Literacy as a Sexual Violence Prevention Strategy. My name is Liz Zadnick. I'm the Capacity Building Specialist at the New Jersey Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And I'm very excited to present this to you today and to hear from you about the strategy that we developed. What I've been asked is to just, if you have a question, just please write it down so you remember, and we're going to hold questions till the end. I also welcome you to email me anytime. Even if you, it's not I don't have a limit per person to ask me a question. So you can ask me a question today. You can also email me a question later. So whatever works best for you, I'm more than happy to help with this strategy. And I'll have my contact information at the end of the presentation as well, so in case you didn't get my email. So I have some hopes for our time together today. And again, the camera, the mic, and this lovely podium is going to try its best to ruin it for me. I want to share our process as a state with this strategy and kind of developing it. It was a very practical process, and I worked a lot with preventionists at the local level to develop this strategy. So I want to share with you how this is a practice-informed strategy. I know that there's a lot of emphasis and interest around evidence, but I'm hoping that I can walk you through how we did some evidence-based decision-making in the development of this strategy, as well as how we used research to really bolster the strategy as well. I'll also share how you can get the curriculum. I don't want to make you all jealous, but here's the hard copy. This could be yours. So this is available online on our website, and I'll tell you where you can get it. And I welcome you to use it and to then send any feedback in your implementation to me. Little notes for myself. I'm also a pretty casual presenter, if you haven't picked up on that yet. So I welcome, if you need to use the restroom or take a call, please feel free. I welcome you to please come back, but if you don't want to, I understand. Just don't tell anybody that it wasn't a great workshop. Just keep it to yourself. But let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to travel back in time a little bit to share how the strategy started and then how it's grown into what it currently is. This gorgeous book right here. I want to thank the New Jersey Division on Women, who is our funder for prevention and all sorts of services. That this project was made possible because of funding after Superstorm Sandy. So we were given some funding from the government, and then was dispersed through the Division on Women to both strengthen our prevention capacity as a state in response to what happened to us, and then also to strengthen the direct service aspect. So this is the culmination of work in that prevention vein of things. So but before this Superstorm Sandy money, New Jersey was an empower state. So way back when, we kind of learned how to become a prevention practitioner as a state, and what our identity was going to be. And one of the things that the group really decided on was a strong emphasis on gender equity as a prevention goal, which I love, and I share a lot about it in the curriculum, is that what that process has done in terms of setting up a framework for our work moving forward. We also worked with the Media Literacy Project out of New Mexico to develop a few initial iterations of the curriculum that then really gave birth to what we see today. They did some training with us. It was before my time at NJ CASA, but they did training with preventionists and worked closely with Jyoti, my colleague at NJ CASA, and she really helped. She helped. Not only do I have a phone camera, but now the video camera as well. So here's a little bit about our evidence-based decision making. So we tried to pull the best available research on media literacy education and critical media literacy as a theory to help develop the framework for the curriculum. We also used contextual evidence and experiential evidence. So I joined the team at NJ CASA in 2014, and I wanted to make sure that the curriculum, I was responding to the needs of preventionists. So they had been implementing the curriculum for about a couple years before I came on board. So there was lots of different strategies that everybody was using. But they wanted to make sure that, one, the data that they were collecting and the things that they were learning could be applied from county to county and community to community as much as possible. And that the data that they were collecting could also say something about the whole state. Which is a big feat, and we're still working towards that. But one of the things that they had decided that they wanted to do was to streamline the curriculum a little bit more so that everybody was doing kind of more or less the same thing with some small variations, but everybody was addressing the same session goals each time. So we used a lot of the kind of evidence or practice-based evidence when we were developing the curriculum. So, gender and violence, how media shape our culture. So we used existing literature. We tried to focus on specific behavior change as it related to media literacy. So it wasn't a few previous iterations of the curriculum or the strategy included a bystander intervention component. But folks really felt like it wasn't the way that it was done wasn't giving bystander intervention the kind of time and space that it needed. I mean, if anyone's implemented bystander intervention, it takes time, right? You really have to invest some time and some energy and some trust building and some kind of mutual respect when you're doing that process. And to fit it into one session, it just felt like it wasn't living up to the spirit of bystander intervention. So we focused more on what's called media reconstruction, or taking pieces of media or examples of media and turning them on their head a little bit to challenge the status quo, or creating brand new media examples altogether. There's also proactive media consumer or proactive media activism, and this was, again, kind of creating new media that would speak to peers, speak to the community specifically. So those were the ways that we kind of built some behavior change and skills into the strategy as well. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, but we have modifications and optional activities within the curriculum that talk specifically about sexual orientation and race. And I'm going to share more about why that we kind of framed it that way in a little bit. So we used the approach of, I sat down with the preventionists from our 22 programs, and we went through each session over the course of a few months and looked specifically at goals of each session, connecting them with goals of the curriculum, risk and protective factors that we know from the literature connected to perpetration of sexual violence, as well as media literacy theory and research around media literacy and critical media literacy. So we wanted to develop and wanted to find from the group the most effective activities and methods for achieving these goals, and then connecting each activity to the overall strategy goals and the session goals. So everything is very interwoven to each other, so everything has a purpose. But we didn't want to make it really prescriptive, so the media examples need to be gathered by the audience. So the participants, if you want to take this strategy and implement it in your community, what you're going to need to do is ask the community, what media are you consuming? And then use those as examples. But the guide in the strategy, the curriculum, is going to help you facilitate conversations in a really meaningful way. We have some evaluation data, but not enough that I feel comfortable sharing. We try to go in a two-pronged approach to our evaluation strategy, which was a third-party observer checklist, which through the course of our conversations evolved into a facilitator reflection sheet. So rather than having someone who may not ever facilitate the curriculum checking to see if you're doing it right, you get a chance to reflect on what you just implemented. And I'm going to show you what that looks like later on in the workshop. And then we have an outcome tool, which is it's kind of standard pre and post test that looks at media consumption, attitudes about gender, attitudes about relationships and peers, and then behaviors that are specifically tied to that media activist piece. So how are they talking back to media that they find harmful or negative? So those are the tools that we used, and that is still kind of being updated. I'll share a little bit with you about that, and I'm actually more than happy to share the outcome tool with you if you're interested. You can email me. So I'm a big proponent of adult learning theory, which is making me feel very, very anxious. So from a visual learners like myself, here's just a quick timeline of what I just talked about. So we had Empower, which was quite a number of years ago, and then that evolved into the Media Literacy Project. Then we had implementation, and then we kind of had our SSBG, or our Superstorm Sandy money, and that prevention initiative. So let's get into the meat of things and talk about what media literacy is and how we in New Jersey connect it to sexual violence prevention. I'm going to hold this for the end, just so that that's what I was asked to do. So I personally love, and see a lot of value in the public health approach and kind of how folks have used that to create change and to create healthier communities. But when it came to some of the work that we were doing in New Jersey, we felt as though, and this was, if anyone took the workshop yesterday, now I almost said Monday, because that's how my week's gone. It was the campus, the weight we choose to carry. We were talking a little bit about how the public health approach and model is wonderful, but sometimes it can't address the political aspects of prevention or some of the more cultural aspects of prevention. So we feel as though media literacy fills that gap. And the framework of media literacy as a social change and anti-oppression theory and strategy it makes a more holistic approach. So this is just something from an article, a piece of research that I absolutely used to build the curriculum. And I love spaces must be opened up and opportunities created. So people in marginalized positions have the opportunity to collectively struggle against oppression, to voice their concerns, and to create their own representations. So we really felt as though that got at the knowledge, the attitudes, but then also the behavior that we really want to take people, the journey that we want to take people on with prevention. I don't know if we're allowed to, but do we want to open the door in the back? Or is it just me that's on fire? But that would be great. Maybe, is that okay with everybody? Okay, great. And if it gets too distracting, again, we're all in this together. So we're here with each other. So here is the curriculum. This is what you're going to see and find if you choose to check this out. So we have some background, research, tips from facilitators that came from preventionists in New Jersey. So they are really sharing their expertise with you and their lessons learned. And then a little bit about the evaluation guidance around the process tools. And then we have a 7-session outline. So each session has some timing. So it could take from 1 hour to 90 minutes. An agenda that we encourage you to follow, because this is what we found in New Jersey to work the best, with making sure folks get what we're wanting them to get. We have the modifications and the optional activities depending on the community that you're working with and what you feel the needs are. And then the facilitator reflection sheet at the end of every session for you to take some time to kind of reflect and process what the session meant to you and what you think needs to be done in the future. And then we have an appendix full of wonderful handouts that you can use in this session, and then to help even just boost your knowledge about media literacy. I almost said, does anyone have questions? I was so quick to forget. So our primary focus, when we looked at risk factors specifically, we're at the individual level. That's where we kind of see the strength of the strategy, is really at the individual level. We do have some relationship level and some societal level, just because it's social media or media literacy. But we looked at specifically at victim blaming attitudes, rape myth acceptance, and then traditional gender role adherence with the curriculum. Those are the risk factors that we really looked at. Because of the gender equity goal specifically, we are working very hard on trying to find a way to address hypermasculinity within the curriculum. Some preventionists in New Jersey have worked specifically with young men, and they've really catered a lot of the media examples to talk specifically about masculinity and male bodies and the way that male bodies are represented in the media. But we didn't really feel as though that could be woven into the curriculum quite as strongly as we wanted to. But we see this as the first stop in our journey around media literacy as a strategy. So we're really hoping to develop additional tools for us to use and then for you all to use. So you might be wondering, how do those risk factors connect to the content, Liz? I need to know. So we have victim blaming attitudes. I pulled out a couple of sessions, session 2, session 3, 4, 5, and 6. Session 1 is an introduction to media literacy specifically. So it's kind of a way for you as a facilitator to say, this is what we're going to be doing, and these are the skills that you're going to need in order to kind of actively participate and be engaged in the content of the sessions. So that first session is really about what persuasion techniques are in media, what media is, and kind of getting some feedback from participants about what media they consume. So that is a really big session. It's so important because that sets the foundation for the rest of the sessions, but it's not necessarily connected specifically to a risk and protective factor. Does that make sense? Okay. So don't think that it's not important. It's very important. So we really saw victim blaming attitudes being most addressed in session 3, where we look specifically at media examples. So we have session 1 where we talk about media literacy skills. Session 2 is really about what is gender. And we've initially in earlier iterations collapsed these 2 sessions into one, where we were talking about gender and then we were looking at gender. And preventionists really found that this kind of organically became 2 sessions. So we just pulled it out into 2. And so the session 3 is really where you're looking specifically at media and having conversations about how media shapes or is influenced by social norms around gender, and also how these kind of norms influence our attitudes about sexual violence, because preventionists are going in as folks representing sexual violence programs in New Jersey. So they're coming in with that expertise and that framework. So rape myth acceptance is also talked about in session 3 and 4. So session 4, we look specifically at video games and music videos, whereas in session 3, it's advertisements, commercials, or things that are kind of generated by the participants as media that they consume. So again, we'll talk specifically about how, and it's very interesting, kind of as a side note, is that preventionists didn't use the same examples, right? Because whether their participants pulled the examples specifically and gave them to them, or they had some prepared already, all victim blaming and rape myths and traditional gender roles came up no matter what, which is both depressing but also really helpful to you as as potential facilitators, that you don't have to worry about like, oh, how's this going to come up? Not that you were, but I'm just saying you don't have to be. So then we have traditional gender role adherence that comes up in the real bulk of the curriculum. So sessions 1 and session 7 are really about skill building. So we kind of bookend the meaty bits with the kind of behavior and skill building. And then hypermasculinity, I wanted to include it because I think that preventionists are really invested in dismantling hypermasculinity and offering some alternatives to kind of dominant norms around masculinity. And another thing that I forgot to mention is that New Jersey is an incredibly diverse state. So a lot of times preventionists were talking to groups of Latina teens or Latino teens, African American youth, white youth, older folks, parents, people with disabilities, folks that were in juvenile detention facilities. So it kind of ran the gamut with in addition to kind of the traditional school setting. So I think that hypermasculinity and discussions around hypermasculinity and traditional gender roles also was very different across the sites and across the counties. But hypermasculinity was really something that we couldn't quite get it together, but we're working on it. So great segue into this conversation around culturally relevant content. So initially, the curriculum was called, I think, like Gender, Race, and Sexuality, how media defines our behaviors and society and all of this stuff. And preventionists found that very similar to the bystander intervention piece that I shared earlier, is that they weren't giving enough space to those conversations, and they didn't feel as though 8 sessions was enough to get that in. So we narrowed the focus down to gender as the primary focus. One, because this was the strength overwhelmingly of the group of preventionists. They could talk about gender, they could talk about sexism, they could talk about traditional gender norms and connections to risk and protective factors in a way that they felt strongly confident overall. So we really wanted to hone in on those risk and protective factors as well. And many times, and I'm sure you all can relate to this, could you come in and just jam all 8 sessions into one day? And by one day, I mean 45 minutes. So folks were really struggling to really give an appropriate amount of time and energy to conversations around race and racial justice and sexual orientation and gender identity. So what we did with this first kind of version or first step in the journey is we focused on gender. But we wanted to give facilitators in New Jersey and beyond an opportunity and some kind of field-tested activities to talk about race and sexuality. So here's what we did. So we have those modifications and optional activities. These can either be subbed in for activities within the session. So at the end, so like I said, you have the agenda and the timing, you have the session content, and then you have the modifications at the end. So what you can do, and we made sure that the timing was right as well. So we don't have a 15-minute activity that could sub in for a 45-minute activity, because that wouldn't be helpful. So you can replace things depending on the participants in the group that you're talking to, or you can add it on, which many times preventionists did. If they were given additional time, so if they had 90 minutes with a group, especially if this was like an after-school program, or if they were talking to youth in juvenile detention facilities, they were given a little extra time, and then this is where they set the foundation to gender, and then we could also talk about race primarily. And that was wonderful because they got to talk about intersectionality. So they didn't have to sub one out for another. They could kind of have a rich dialogue. But and the same for sexual orientation and unfortunately gender identity to a lesser extent right now. We're definitely working on that, as well as socioeconomics. So a large contingent of preventionists talked a lot about class when it came to media literacy with a lot of the groups that they spoke to. So we're also working on activities to include for that in the future. So I wanted to show you one of the activities when I was planning this workshop originally. I was like, oh, I'll get like 10 people and we can do some hands-on activities. So I had to kind of think on my feet with this one, and we're just going to kind of do this collectively together. So this activity is from session 2. It's the stereotype analysis of the Latin lover. So what you talk about is the 6 stereotypes of Latina and Latinos in the media, and you focus primarily on the Latin lover, which is often seen as a positive stereotype. So the curriculum points specifically to the Dos Equis, the most interesting man in the world. So what you would do is show some commercials over and over again to kind of talk about how many times is the most interesting man in the world looked adoringly at by the people in the frame, or how many women are in the frame as opposed to men or him specifically, or what do other men in the commercial look like? What are they doing? So you get to have this conversation about race and also about masculinity. So this was a pretty popular activity because it started to address that hypermasculinity piece. So for folks who can't read this up here, I'm sorry, it's so small. It says the most interesting man in the world on being boring. Being boring now is a choice. Mild salsas and pleated khakis aren't going to buy themselves. And if you don't use your backup plan, you are playing it too safe. So just a few quick questions does this work for the recording if I just ask for a couple examples? Okay, great. So what are some of the things that are happening in this ad that might be consistent with the stereotype of a Latin lover? Or you could even think of other Dos Equis commercials that you've seen. We also wanted to be really mindful about promoting positive connections and acknowledging protective factors and resilience factors within the participants. So where do we start? So there are kind of some protective factors. We looked at teen dating violence, which was something that overlapped a lot with preventionist work, with media literacy and in a lot of schools. And then relationship or relational, the connection and commitment to school. So we wanted to kind of cultivate educators and folks within the school to continue to promote media literacy going forward. We also just kind of had a brainstorming session about what strengths and how do you promote resilience as a facilitator when you're working with a group. And they wanted to pull specific examples of how youth, particularly when they're in a detention facility or if they're experiencing violence in the home, how perhaps they're resilient in just their ability to come to school or to have a conversation or to get good grades and to be a good sister or brother or nephew, to really highlight those elements of their identity as well. And then to promote gender equity whenever possible. So how are we talking about men and women in ways that value all contributions? So we also have proactive media consumers, and this is where we talked about media activism. So we're looking at ways that we can build skills that they can take kind of beyond, Oh, I'm a little behind schedule. I'm so sorry. So I'm going to keep going. So we have, in the last session is reconstruction, which is where we have a couple of options for activities. Option A and B could fit into one session, but they can also be supplemented or replaced with a poster campaign or a letter writing project. The creating counter ads is something where you would take an advertisement and you can either blow it up onto like poster size and then have them kind of pull apart different things or add things to them or create collages, or create ads completely new, right? So like, how would you sell, well, you don't want to say how would you sell alcohol because you don't really want them to do that, but how would you sell, the newest shoe, or how would you sell something else? Yeah. Oh yeah. Or those Old Spice. I'm sorry. How would you sell deodorant? Because I just saw the new Old Spice ads, and they went back to the other guy, and then they have Terry Bradshaw, and they're like, is it Terry Bradshaw? Terry Crews. I'm sorry. Where they're like fighting or yelling over each other, and they're like, it's like Bear Claw. And then what does the other guy say? Anyway, so they're like yelling at each other about deodorant, and they both have no shirts on, and it's confusing. So then they also have the talk back, which is where you'd have an ad, and it's maybe poster size, and given whatever's happening on the ad, you then have the participants or the youth talk back to what it's saying. Like, I'm not, this body type isn't most valuable, or I'm a man and I reject giant muscles or something like that. So right now I'm stuck in the Old Spice commercial, but different ways that they can kind of say, like, I reject this message, I don't want it. And then the poster campaign is where perhaps they would use these counter ads around school, around their communities, or around whatever space that them and their peers are in. So it can kind of create a larger dialogue around media literacy. And then the letter writing campaign is where they kind of identify, either as a group or individually, a kind of problematic advertiser or company, and create or write letters about how it's harmful and send them in. So they're actually interacting and having their voices heard. So it's really about taking them on this journey of learning that they can do this, they can be critical of media, and then ways that they can be critical of media, and then giving them an opportunity to actually do it. And preventionists found that these last two sessions, where they really look specifically at media activism and proactive media consumerism, were the most powerful. But that could also be because they developed this trust and this dialogue where they were having conversations with participants, rather than just talking at participants. And this is a handout that's in I don't know why, I was like, this is going to be super tiny, but I had big hopes, big dreams that you would be able to see it. But that just lists all of the different ways that folks can create counter ads. So have I piqued your interest yet in learning more? So what you can do if you want to check out the curriculum in its entirety, as well as I'm going to show you, so you get the curriculum, I'm changing screens, as well as a PowerPoint that you can use. It's branded, so it's consistent with the handouts and things like that goes through the persuasion techniques. So you start out with, you might say, today I'm going to be here for the next couple of weeks or months, talking with you about media. You can add your logo, your services, a little bit about yourself, or kind of if you've been in the setting before, kind of doing a recap of that, and then going into the language of persuasion, which is where you talk about what is media. I have this example, and what preventionists found to be most helpful is to use kind of an ad or an example that was kind of didn't really have gender didn't play a part in it, so that you could kind of pull those things out and do some skill building and talk about what is media and how do you do it, and who creates it and what's it for, and they're often trying to sell you something, those sorts of things. And then you go into how media makers always have a purpose. They always have a message, and that message is often you need to change, or you need to buy this, or you can buy this and change in the way that we want you to. So here's just another example. This is like Kermit. This is another kind of example that's divorced from gender, unless you assign a gender to Kermit. So they choose their messages wisely. So you would go through all of these different persuasion techniques, and these are in the curriculum. So there's like a very lengthy example of each. So you could give out handouts for folks, or you could go through each one of these, or both. But this is all created for you and is part of the materials that you can download. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, so here is where, after you go through those examples that don't include gender, you might include gendered examples to now deconstruct and ask what persuasion techniques are being used in this ad. So we have an Under Armour ad. What's beautiful? Judging yourself in miles, not inches, right? But let's take a look at the bodies that we see in that ad. And what are they doing, right? So we could even talk about ability. So the ability to run, the desire to run, right? Because fitness, but at what cost, everybody? So then we could also talk about men as well. Fear no element, right? And I think Under Armour, I hope there aren't any Under Armour folks in here, right? We're all friends. But the protect this house, right? That's their tagline. That's on all over everything. So then we have this guy, and I guess the assumption is that it's winter, but he has shorts on because he doesn't fear any elements or frostbite or anything. So we have some examples there. So there's these materials are available to you. You do not have to use them. But one of the things that preventionists really encouraged was we all want to be saying the same thing, and creating PowerPoints is not fun for some folks. So to kind of have something so that they can focus on researching the media examples and making sure that they're speaking the language of the participants. So you're welcome to use this, but it's by no means you don't have to. You go to njcasa.org, you go to Learn, which is the first thing up there, and then you click on Prevention, and you'll see a heading for media literacy. And what we're asking, because I'm sure you're all aware of just how we have to report back to funders about how the reach of this curriculum, there's just a short form. So I'm just asking for your name, your organization, the state that you're in, and how you intend to use the curriculum. And then you have to answer a math question at the end, just so that we know there's no robots filling it out. And just use the actual number. Don't write the number word. Just you're just gonna you're gonna put one thing into that field. And then you'll be directed to a page, and you can download the curriculum. I encourage you to favorite the page just in case, so that you can go right back to it without having to fill the form out again. But if there's any issues, feel free to email me. But just, we just want to be able to capture information quickly. We won't share that with anybody. We don't share that information with anyone, so you don't have to worry about that. So, a quick note, you might be sitting here and going, Liz, let's talk about copyright already, because please. Did someone say yes? You're my friend. So a quick note, and this is in the curriculum. We had some concerns about folks. How are we going to do this without getting in trouble? So the entire curriculum is built on copyrighted content. that you're pulling in to do education with, to do sexual violence prevention with. But this is different than using media in education. This is media literacy education. So by design, you need copyrighted content for it, and it is protected under the fair use clause of copyright law. So there's a lot of guidance within the educational and classroom setting around media literacy, education, and critical media literacy. So, and educational settings are kind of broadly defined, right? So if you're using examples of media like with, I was very careful. We did a media literacy example with that Dos Equis ad, right? So I'm modeling what I'm asking for. So what you're going to be doing is using the content and talking and breaking things down. Yes, it may affect the market value and profit of a company to do media literacy, but it's also about critique. It's about creating new things. It's about education. So it really, it's protected under that fair use clause. There's also something to be said behind or before how content is acquired. So if you own a copy of like Dream Worlds, or you own a copy of a documentary, or you own a copy of a Disney movie, let's say, you can use that, from what I understand of the law, in media literacy education, because again, the copyrighted content is about breaking it down. I would just make sure, if you as an organization have like a licensed copy of a documentary or of a DVD, to just review that contract before that license agreement, before you use it in media literacy, just for safety's sake. Because if it says specifically like this can only be used for public screenings, accompanied by, a group discussion, that isn't really media literacy education. That's you showing the movie and then having a conversation about what the movie's talking about, not about the movie specifically. So 3 things that I want you to take away from this slide about copyright and fair use. Use only as much content as necessary. And I'm going to leave that vague on purpose. So again, use only what's necessary for the lesson. And again, this is being taped, so like the jig is up. The jig is up. So attribute generously. So if you have something that's either already been media literacy'd, I guess, or critically analyzed, attribute it. If you are using, a music video, say like, I got this off of Rihanna's Vivo, like, give Rihanna the due that she needs. And empower students to share their work. Because they are also protected for like documentaries and artistic expression, so they can share their work outside the classroom. I mean, this is really about doing some norms change and some attitude change, and if it's confined to the room that you're in or the space that you're in, it's going to have an impact, but it can have an even greater impact when youth are talking to each other. 2 resources that I'll point you to: the Center for Media and Social Impact, and I can write that on there later, has some great like FAQs and like short accessible resources about media literacy and fair use. And then the New Media Rights Group has a fair use app that you can it asks you a few questions and it prompts you, and then you go, yes, no, I'm not sure, and it'll point you to whether it's covered under fair use or not. New Media Rights. So it's the Center for Media and Social Impact was the first one, and New Media Rights is the second one. So evaluating the strategy, again, just like copyright, I'm sure you all are like, where's the data, Liz? Where's the data? So we are working on it, is my answer to that question. But I did want to share with you our process evaluation process. So in the beginning of the workshop, I mentioned that early versions of the process evaluation tool was called a fidelity checklist. And what it was is a third-party observer was kind of like briefed on the curriculum or the strategy, and then sat in on the first 3 sessions and just checked off as much stuff that was covered that they could hear. And this was, initially this was helpful because, facilitators had someone who can say, like, I thought I covered that. That must have been another day, right? Because when you're doing programs, I remember I would be standing in front of a group of 4th graders and be like, did I already say this to you guys? Like, because I had done like four of the same program that week or day. So it was a nice way to kind of check in and make sure that they were covering what they needed to cover. But the feasibility of having a third party, somebody else in the room that wasn't the teacher, because sometimes teachers or the educators or the youth serving professional can't be in the room or can't, it's kind of in and out, just didn't always work, and it wasn't always as helpful as it possibly could be. So in those conversations that we had about the content of the curriculum, it was really what would make the most sense for us to track our process and learning about how to do this curriculum. So we came up with the idea of facilitator reflection sheets. And these are at the end of each session. They cover session goals, really successful activities or kind of discussion or questions that they asked that spurred a lot of dialogue. Any challenges that presented. So when we were talking about the stereotype of the Latin lover, they just didn't get it, right? Like consistently, they're just not getting how a positive stereotype might still be harmful. So what are some of the things that we can do to kind of process that as a group, as well as space to plan for the next session? And we really see this in New Jersey as a way that we can learn from each other. So there's a lot of peer learning that happens in our monthly meetings when we talk to each other, or our regular conversations that we get to have with each other. And these were going to be the tools that helped us continuously improve the strategy. Some preventionist feedback for you all to know is they said that this really helped them in the planning process because it built in reflection time that they don't often get, right? So, and many times they did it in the car, after that session was over, or they did it in the break room or wherever they were after they did the session, they quick filled it out. So it was an opportunity for them not to just be pushing out information, but to also be kind of absorbing some of the great stuff that was happening. And they said over and over again, I heard that it was a good check-in to gather your thoughts. So let's take a look at what the facilitator reflection sheet looks like. Is this big enough, or should I just go full view? So here's session 1, which is our talking about media literacy skills specifically. So we have our goals for the session. So do you feel as though participants are better able to do the following after this session? Describe common types of media. So we have yes, no, I'm not sure. Describe ways media shape attitudes. Describe ways media messages affect our thoughts, attitudes, actions, or emotions. Describe how media is created with a target audience in mind. Describe the visual parts of a piece of media, or what they learn in the session to be called the text. And describe the hidden message of the piece of media, which in the session they learn to be called the subtext. So again, yes, no, not sure. Again, this isn't a punitive tool. It's not like you failed as a facilitator if you have 2 no's, right? It's just a way for you to check in that these are concepts that you need to kind of strengthen later. Again, so kind of going through the persuasion techniques that that I went through in the PowerPoint. So just try to circle the concepts you feel successfully or effectively presented. So essentially, or ideally, you'd want all of these to be covered. But that's a lot to ask, especially of a certain age group that you're going to be working with. And we really designed the curriculum to be like 9th or 10th graders. And for them to absorb a lot of the information is a lot. And especially we found oftentimes they were like, is this going to be on a test? And they like really got anxious about it. So I think that, making sure that it's more of a dialogue. So again, not punitive if all of these aren't circled. We also have two versions within that PowerPoint file. One is a more kind of introductory format with the persuasion techniques that we kind of all agreed on were like the core ones, the most important or the most prevalent. And then there's also, then there's also a more kind of comprehensive format of the PowerPoint within that file where you talk about all of them. And again, so depending on what format or what PowerPoint presentation you did, you would circle the different techniques. So what felt successful? What challenges did you encounter? How did you overcome or redirect these challenges? So especially if we're talking about gender, race, sexual orientation, gender identity, there's lots of things that can come up. Someone said it earlier, you need to be prepared for what participants are going to say. So how did we kind of navigate those conversations? What would you do differently the next time you present this content or session? So maybe you might not be able to go back and redo something with this participant group, but when you do the strategy with another group, I got to remember to do this. And this was the question that preventionists were most excited about because it's like a way that they can go back and look at something as they're planning the next site or community that they're going to be working with. What would you keep the same the next time you present this? So this was also a great question that they were like, I couldn't remember how I phrased that question, or I couldn't remember what media example I used or how it came up. But making sure, yes. This is the process evaluation. So someone asked, could this be used in the process evaluation? So this is the process evaluation tool that we kind of formulated. So thank you. I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear earlier. What would you like to cover in session 2? And this is an opportunity for you to be like, oh, I have to talk about this some more. Or I have to talk about this in session 2 or session 3. And these are the same questions for every session. You just don't see the persuasion techniques in every session. So you don't really cover them every time. Okay. Oh, I'm still in preview. So here's the sheets. Again, I was living in a fantasy world where this would be big enough for you to read or see. But this is just what session 1 looks like. So in addition to a process evaluation or kind of capturing how we're implementing the curriculum and what lessons we're learning, what things we're doing, we also attempted some outcome evaluation. So we did a pre-post test, and there were like 3 or 4 versions of these kind of throughout the life of the strategy. The one we kind of settled on most recently and that folks have been using looks at media consumption. So again, it's those questions about like, how often are you reading it? Well, we didn't say reading a newspaper. That was in the original curriculum. But how often are you going to news sources, or are you going to peers to get information? Do you watch the TV, or are you on, do you follow blogs? Like things like that. Then gender-based attitudes, and we pulled these from the adolescent attitudes towards women scale and a couple of other gender-based scales specifically for adolescents that got at gender-related attitudes. Then we had media activism and their confidence around being able to do a certain thing or their likelihood of doing a certain thing. And then in the post-test we had, did you do this? So like, since you've been participating in this program, have you left a comment on a YouTube video? Have you written a letter to a corporation that you find has an offensive ad? Have you stopped buying products that because of their advertising? And then also on the post test is feedback for the facilitator. So did you feel as though you were respected? Did you feel as though this space was safe? Was there time for questions? So those things that can help facilitators in planning future sessions. So the direction that we may or may not be going in New Jersey is using different existing scales in capturing outcome measures, but we're still trying to investigate where outcome tools can be most useful and can kind of yield the most helpful information. But like I had mentioned earlier, if you're interested in seeing our outcome tools, I'm more than happy to share them with you. And if you want to say, oh, this is a great question, but I don't really understand this question, because we're still learning in New Jersey about what our outcome tool is going to look like, we're more than welcome that feedback. And if you choose to implement it, if you're willing to share your aggregated data or information that you learn, we'd also truly appreciate that as well. So I have a couple of interactions because I need a sip of water at this point, and I want to hear kind of from you and kind of open it up to hear from folks. So, why are you interested in media literacy? What brought you to this workshop today when there's so many wonderful workshops out there? So another question that I wanted to pose to you is, how can this connect or complement other efforts that you're already implementing? So something that preventionists in New Jersey found is that when they were doing bystander intervention, this fit very well. When they were doing teen dating violence or adolescent relationship abuse prevention, this fit really well. When they were doing a lot of their other kind of like if a school asked, oh, hey, can you come talk about sexual harassment? This was another great complement to those efforts. So I wanted to hear, how do you see this fitting in with some of the things that you're already doing? Well, we have 4 minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hang out here, and if you wanted to come and share a comment or a thought or a question, I'll be here. Again, feel free, connect with us on social media, which is a great thing to say, and feel free to email anytime.